Well, welcome everyone to this episode. This is going to be a very interesting one. It's going to be on the good old controversial topic of is tithing for today. In fact, I'm going to do this as a series and see if we can get a couple of people on sharing different views, because I know there are lots of views out there. And today I have the privilege of interviewing Dr. Brendan Roach, and I'll just give you his background because it's quite fascinating. He's the founder of basically an online Bible college, which he set up in 2018, which is designed to give high quality, free training to pastors and leaders around the world. And I believe it's now in 169 countries across the world, which is amazing. I wish our ministry had that kind of reach, because that's a spectacular result in such a short space of time. And really, it's trying to help pastors who are some living in poverty, some who are under persecution, and helping them obviously to become theologically trained, because many of them don't have access or easy access to colleges in the way that we do in the West. So amazing effort with Brendan and his team at Axx Global. But he's also been a local church pastor. So I have full credit to anyone who goes down that path in life. That's a tough one. And he's been a Bible college professor. And recently, prior to setting up Axx Global, he was the president of a Bible college where he trained pastors and leaders around the world. So it's a real privilege, Brendan, to have you today. So thank you for being with us.
Great, thanks, Alex. It's exciting to be with you, and hopefully some local church pastors and other people will still be speaking to me at the end of this conversation.
Well, they might speak to you. Maybe they won't speak to me. Depends on whose side.
True.
So yeah,
true.
It's always a tough one. But look, tithing. So we want to obviously it is a controversial topic. Some people say it's for today. Some people say it's it's an Old Testament thing, it doesn't apply anymore. So there's a lot of difference of opinion out there. But really, all I wanted you to today is to really share your heart on it, to share your convictions. Obviously, we all come at it from the point of view that we believe God's word is true and infallible, and therefore that's really I think the starting point for all these kind of discussions. And then and then from there we can just unpack it and get your impressions on it. But I thought, because tithing is a concept that I don't think it's necessarily taught that well anyway, irrespective of which side of the fence people sit on, I don't think it's actually taught that well, in the sense that I don't think many people understand the history of it, why it was brought in, and just they don't really get the whole reason behind it. They're just told they have to tithe. They're not necessarily given a big background to it. So I thought it'd be good to start just with looking at the Old Testament, and in particular how tithing was practiced. How many tithes were there? Because I know there was more than one. And how did they tithe? Did they just get their local currency and coins? And how do they do it, or was it something else? So I thought that'd be a useful place to start.
Yeah, I think tithing is a very interesting topic, and I'm going to put it up front here. I'm by no means an expert in the field, but like most of us, we've got a view that we've formed over many years, and going back and doing some additional research on this, there is absolute confusion out there as to how many tithes there are and things like that. So I think there's been identified up to 3 different tithes. But in my reading and understanding, I think what it sort of comes across as is you tithe on what comes in at a particular time of the year. You also, there's even the potentiality for tithing on a crop, not when it comes in, but tithing on your crop when it's going to be sown. And that particularly becomes important during the sabbatical year and the 50th year, where there's no crops that are being planted. So that's put into the storehouse. And then when you go to plant your crop, that's at the moment that you tithe. So it's depending on what scriptures you read and how you read it. And even I quite often go and see what the Jewish rabbis are saying about the Old Testament, particularly when it comes around areas of law. And there is multiple understandings and multiple interpretations. So my discussion with you today is going to be based on principles.
That's probably, yeah.
not direct scripture quotes, because looking at that, I think this is one area that is massively open to interpretation. So what are the principles that we can live by? What are the principles that we can understand? So for me, the simple foundational principle that we find in the Old Testament is that you give 10% of what comes in. Now, most of the time, I'm just going to throw it out there and say 99% of the community was agricultural in some way. It's nothing like it is today.
Yeah.
So your
Totally
crops
different
come
world.
in, you tithe 10% of your crop. The animals give birth, and therefore that is your increase. So it's always on the increase. That is your increase, and it's 10% of that. You go out fishing, 10% of what you bring in that day. And then you had the smaller groups of people that were working in areas of construction and different things like that. But even in the earlier days of the Old Testament, they're nomadic. They're living in small villages. They're probably building their own things. There isn't a lot of that. So that's the foundational principles that I sort of find there in the Old Testament. So of course we understand tithing comes from the Hebrew word meaning a tenth. So I don't think there's any confusion on that. Yeah. So first, tithing first starts as a principle of offering. So go back, Cain and Abel. So you've got Cain and Abel both giving their offerings. One's giving an offering of crops, one's giving an offering of animals, representing the two different spheres of agriculture. And what happens in that process is that we see that, you know, God wasn't happy with one of those offerings. They say, well, how could God not be happy with one of those offerings? And there's no discussion about percentages at this point in time. So we've got, what happens is, and I'm not a farmer or an agriculturalist in any way, but if you take the best seed and replant that, you are going to get better, healthier, more productive crops. If you take the best animals and reproduce from them, you are going to get stronger, healthier animals. So what the principle was that you would give your best to God, which is completely counterintuitive. And that's the whole point of tithing. It's counterintuitive to the way you would understand things working. So one takes their rubbish stuff that they, you know, isn't worth very much. It might be, let's not worry about percentages, but if it was 10%, say 10% of rubbish, seed and animals, the other one gives high quality. So the first principle that we come against is that when we're giving to God, we give our best. Now, as time's gone on, that's now morphed into money, coins, Bitcoins, credits. Very little barter going on in our society these days, although there's a nice little underground culture of barter going on, I think, out there. But yeah, so that's the first principle that I think we should be aware of, the Cain and Abel. So you got to go back to the idea of first principles in the Bible, and a lot of them are found in the book of Genesis. So where did the concept come up first? So it's about giving an offering to God, and even how you give an offering to God in that passage is completely vague. You know, is God coming down and having a snack? Is there a representative? You know, there's a lot of stuff going on, but that's not explained because that's not the importance of how. Leviticus is full of how, right? This is the principle of that you always give God your best.
And that ties into this whole first fruits concept that people often quote.
I think first fruits. But I think it's also the first fruits concept is the idea that when your crop starts to come in, the first thing you do is give to God.
Yeah.
So if you're looking again at the agricultural scene, if something's perishable, or if something is you're giving, it's you the first thing and you can imagine you're an agricultural society, you've been waiting months, your food supplies are running low, particularly if you're thinking about the droughts in biblical times. What are you going to do? You want to get in, but there's another important principle in that. There's a principle of celebration, of coming together. We're very individualistic now. So in the first fruits, it's the community coming together and celebrating with each other the provision that God has given to them as a community. This might be a village of a couple of hundred people, or something like that. So we're celebrating what God has done for us, not for me. Because you can be guaranteed in a small village environment, if someone's got a good crop, their neighbor's got a good crop. If someone's had a good, amount of lambs or goats being born, then, they would, because the environmental conditions are similar.
Similar, yeah. Makes sense, yeah.
So you've got that joining together and celebrating together as a community. The next thing we note is the idea of Melchizedek comes in very early in Genesis, where it talks about the principle of then where we get the first idea of a tithe coming in, 10% coming in. So the second principle that we see there is a tithe is given to someone greater than you. So Abraham is someone who's living nomadically. There's an idea out there that he was even a mercenary for hire, as in he's got a lot of guys that he can call on. Shepherds who are out there living on their own have to be fairly handy looking after themselves compared to the guy living in a palace surrounded by walls. So he's Melchizedek is the king. Abraham comes back in, and the king, what does the king do? The king gives protection. The king gives you the right to live in his land. The king gives you the ability to conduct trade and business. So the king, like government, the king is the one who oversees everything and allows you to operate a business, allows you to live on the land. There's no such thing as having individual title. If you're strong enough, you own the land. Yeah. So the principle comes in that the tithe is to honor someone who is greater than you. So we then get, okay, so we're giving an offering. We've now got a number to it, 10%. And that 10% is to be given to someone greater than you. But this person is an interesting character, as we see in Hebrews 7. He's not only a king, he's also a priest. So we've got the combination of the two. So we're not only having the civil government military leader, but we also have the spiritual leader packaged together in one. So we then get the third principle, which is the tithe is to be given to the representative of God, the priest. And as evangelicals, Pentecostals, non-Orthodox communities, we get very nervous about that idea of a priest. So the priest is a representative of God. And so there's a little bit of, we feel just intuitively uncomfortable about that. I grew up Roman Catholic, so I have a level of comfort with the concept, understanding, taking an evangelical perspective, that person does priestly function, but as a Pentecostal evangelical believer, I believe I have direct access to God. I have a level of comfort with the idea, but many evangelicals don't have any level of comfort with the idea of a priest. So, which then evolves into apostle, pastor, prophet, bishop in the New Testament anyway. So we've got that idea. So that principle of that the tithe is to be given to God's representative on earth, the priest. So that was sort of the when we look in the book of Genesis, those for me are the founding principles. One, that we give our best to God. Two, the 10% comes in. And I would suggest to you that 10% number never varies throughout the whole of the Old Testament. And three, that is to be given to God's representative, i.e. the priest. So that's my foundational principles around tithing when we look at the very beginning of the book of Genesis.
That's interesting. I'm thinking here, if you would apply a modern day application to that, particularly the first one where you say giving your best, we're a stewardship ministry, and so I help people with budgeting. One of the things I see is that often God gets the scraps. So in other words, people work out their rent, their mortgage, their car, their insurance, their school, they work out everything else. And if there's left over, then God gets some of that. So I think that's probably the norm in Western culture, I suspect. Maybe not so amongst mature believers, but I think that's the fair norm. So it seems like we've got it the wrong way around if we were to apply that principle to it.
Yeah, I think back before, back on, a little bit older now, and I spiritually grew up right in the Pentecostal heat of the end coming and the mark of the beast and don't have a credit card or a checkbook, or everything has to be in cash. But even with that, I remember going and getting my first paycheck, and I go to the pay window and a little paper envelope, and I got my $20 in cash, so to speak, when I was working at Kmart as a 15-year-old.
Yeah.
So, and I remember coming back, and one day and my mum said, well, you got to tithe on that. You've got to start. I don't even know if she used the word. She said, you've got to give to God, because she's a Roman Catholic. So there wasn't that much of a concept of tithing as such.
Yeah.
And I was sort of like, oh, how much? And she just blurted out an amount. I went, oh, that's a lot. Anyway, so, anything was a lot for a 15-year-old.
I was going to say, with my kids, everything, when you mention giving, everything is a lot.
Yeah. But I remember when we started to do it, you would get cash, so I think it was probably, even for want of a better word, worse back then, because unless you physically put the cash aside, if you got paid on Wednesday, you've got to last to Sunday.
Yeah.
And, is that money going to be there? So unless you physically put it aside, having that cash in your wallet was a huge temptation. Now, with direct debiting and stuff like that you can regular giving that you can do, set it up in your bank account. It's in that way, if you make the decision, as long as things aren't, hugely economically tight and the money's there, you sort of, the decision's made and you're going to be fine. But you really had to, by Sunday, you could see people ferreting around in their wallet, and you could hear the coins being dropped in and, I need to do something, sort of thing. So it was, so it had to be for me, it always had to be and it was a family decision. This is what we're going to do. Money set aside, physically out of the wallet, set aside somewhere, take it to church on Sunday, and put it in the offering.
Fantastic. No, look, great insight there. Just on coming back to, I guess, some of the history of it.
Yeah.
Why did tithing actually exist? Why do you think God instituted, if you like, this system? What was sort of the purpose behind it? Because with my sort of understanding, I've picked up on it, it seems to me to be quite a good economic system, where, in terms of the way they helped poor with it, the way they funded the ministry with it, the festivals, all those kind of things. Seemed to me like quite an interesting system. What was its sort of purpose? Why did it exist?
I think when you look at it, and I think when you look at it as an economic system, you again go back to Melchizedek. Melchizedek had two roles. He was king, so that meant that he was military, civil, legal, was all the responsibilities that fell under him, exactly the same as David and Solomon. They were in charge of the armies, they were in charge of peace, they were in charge of law, governance, those sort of things. Then you've got the spiritual community as well. So you've got there was no government as we understand it. Those of us who have lived in the last 100 years have lived in a society that is very atypical to the rest of what history has been like. So social welfare in the Roman Empire was they would give out bread when things would get a bit tough. That was the level of it.
Yeah.
So
bit different to today's expectations.
Yeah. So you go 100 years ago, no one was offering free education, or certainly free education, except the church, which is an interesting thing that a lot of people who want to criticize orphanages and early Christian schools and what went on there, which wasn't great, but what went on there 99.9% of the time was people being educated and fed and housed and being looked after, because no one was doing it. It was the elite who were being educated. So you go back into a society where there is, there's no healthcare, there's no school, there's no there's nothing being done for you as an individual. What's being done is you're being co-opted into build a pyramid. You're being co-opted into building an aqueduct. You're being co-opted into building a road when there's no crops to be done, and you're not being paid for that labor. So because you just do it because the people in charge say, well, you can do it, or you can go into slavery. You can work for us for a couple of months for free, or you can go into slavery permanently. Which would you like? So wow. The Hebrew or the Jewish culture, let's call it the Hebrew culture. The Hebrew culture of the Old Testament starts to develop this holistic attitude towards life. That's why we have 613 commandments, and that's why they vary across what food you eat, when do you pray, what do you do with this, what happens when you get sick. All of these sort of issues come up in the Torah. the first 5 books, and then are elaborated on as you go on, because it's how to live as a society, how to live as a community. So then there was an understanding that evolves slowly but consistently, even all the way into the New Testament, about how you live together as a society. And how you live together as a society means that you need to, let's go basic principles. You need to care for the poor and the widows, because men are going to die, maybe in war, maybe from age, maybe from disease. And in that culture, it was the men who looked after the family. You take the man away, the woman can't even have property rights or anything. So she loses everything. It goes off to another brother or a son. And if there's no brother or son, she is completely dependent on charity. So what we would call charity. So what happens, there becomes a system where it says that if you see it, you must leave the corners of your field for the widow. You must give a gold coin. You must. So all of these systems come in place in order to create what we would understand as a social security safety net that's in place to create this culture and this society. So giving becomes an incredibly important part of that. And the first principle is you look after your family. The second principle is you look after your community. The third principle, even if you have a stranger come into your community, there's a minor obligation, as with a nomadic society, that you can't, give someone a cup of water, it says in the New Testament, you don't want them dying from thirst. There's basic fundamental human behavior which must take place. There's a lot of laws around killing and murder. Hebrew has 5 different words for killing someone. So there's a lot of different rules around those sort of ideas and concepts as well. So you get this framework, understanding that the society must operate, and each part of that society needs funds to be able to operate and do their things. So it starts off with the priesthood, and then it goes, well, we're going to need some community things where the government's going to need some stuff to be able to operate, and those sort of things. So that together creates a complex rules and commandments, which is why I'm sure you would understand there is so much talked about money in the Bible, because it's a fundamental part of how we operate together as a community.
And it must have been quite a highly effective system, I'm assuming, though, because really those who were vulnerable in society were actually being taken care of. I assume it was quite effective overall.
Yeah, and I think when here's a little code for you when you're reading the Bible. When it talks about widows and poor, what that discussion is always revolving around is that community adhering to the rule, the Torah, the commandments of God. If they are adhering to the commandments of God, the poor and the widows are always cared for. When they're not looking after the poor and the widows, whether they're being exploited or whether they're dying or whether they're being abused, that means that community is not following the laws of God. So you will see, you can even go into Acts chapter 6, it says, hang on, we're not looking after the widows here. That's wrong. It's actually talking about a bigger thing if we're going to obey the rules of God. The other key word that comes up in the Old and New Testament is circumcision as well. Circumcision, widows, poor. Those are the 3 key words that indicate whether that community, that Hebrew community at that particular location, at that particular time, is obeying the laws and the commands of God, which is hugely financial when you talk about the widows and the poor. You shouldn't have, they're not going to be rich, but they're not going to die, and they're not going to starve to death if the rules of God are being followed. Yes,
so there should be no true poverty in that sense, because people are actually being catered for. They're being looked after by their communities.
And even to the elaboration, the point goes, if you're poor because you're too lazy to get off your backside and work, then that's your problem.
Yeah.
If you're a widow and you're young, go find another husband. If you're, and even if you're a widow, well, don't be idle. You need to do things that might not be enough to maintain your physical well-being economically, but do something. Otherwise you risk becoming an idle gossip if you just sit there and take money. There's actually no concept of you sit and take money and don't do anything for it, which is another interesting principle that we find.
Well, I was going to say, it's very interesting when you compare it to today's society too, because often money is handed out without any expectation. Whereas under this society, everyone would ultimately contribute. And you obviously you'd contribute according to your means and to your circumstance, like if you're a widow. But in modern day society, and obviously in particularly a lot of Western culture, there's not necessarily an obligation on you to contribute per se, which is problematic.
No. Yeah, but they've done, several studies and experiments and trials of things where they've asked people to go out and volunteer if they're on some sort of benefit. And always, particularly it's interesting in current times, always one of the main things that comes out is mental well-being. People feel so much better about themselves if they could go out and contribute and do something. And just to be a little bit sexist for a moment, I think that's incredibly important for men. I find men who aren't physically doing something to contribute, they don't talk about it a lot, but it becomes a huge mental burden that they feel like they've somehow, not performing their function as a provider. Whether that be right or wrong, it's a reality of what's out there.
Well, it's 100% correct. And it's certainly my experience as a financial advisor. And I actually say to men, don't retire, because statistically 80% of their social life is work for a start. So you immediately cut off 80% of your social life the day you retire. But as you say, you're contributing to society. You're more interesting, you're more involved, and you're actively participating. So I think and the outcome of it then is sickness, is what I found, is when they do retire and they just hang up their boots, they actually get sick. But I digress. But it's certainly very true though what you're saying.
So going back to the going back to that societal sort of thing, it's very important that we've talked about community, but let's not forget about spirituality. So it sets up the important principle that the priest Levite needs to be cared for by the community. So they're all giving 10%. So it sets up this really interesting idea, and that sort of gets corrupted a little bit in the New Testament. And if we've got time, we'll talk about that. But you've got a society, and in Jewish culture, if you've got 10 families together, you can come together in some form of worship. So imagine you've got 10 or 20 families together, and there's a tithe coming in, and one of 12 or one of 13 is the Levite who looks after the spiritual needs of that community. It ensures that the Levite, let's just call Levite at the moment, is a person who is living on the same level as the rest of the people in the community. So if there's drought and famine, he's got drought and famine. So it's very highly motivating that they're going to him and saying, which you see when there's drought and famine, hey, what's going on with God? Elijah, get on your knees and start praying. You're the one who's meant to be representing us before God. So it also sets up that baseline of equality, and it ensures that someone who is doing that spiritual function is cared for in the same way that everybody else is cared for. Now we can jump forward, and we've lost a bit of that principle as well, and we can talk about that as a New Testament concept a little bit later.
That's great. Well, actually, funny enough, I was going to jump a little bit to the New Testament and ask you about tithing and can it be found in the New Testament? But also, obviously, the word exists because, you hear Jesus where he's rebuking the Pharisees. But I guess tithing as a concept, is it promoted in the New Testament as well, is what I would add to that? Not just can it be found, but is it promoted as well?
Yeah, I think going back to Acts chapter 6, I mean, there certainly is the quotes that directly talks about tithing. But again, I'm sort of moving forward, giving you the foundation of the Old Testament. Now we come into the New Testament, and we specifically have Acts chapter 6, where it talks about the new community, the Hellenistic community. In other words, the Greek-speaking Jews who are living in what we would call the diaspora, so outside of what we would call Israel today. So they're living in Rome, they're living in Ephesus, they're living in Antioch, living in different places. So the church starts, and it is very much the Hebrews of the community, the Jewish speakers of the community in Jerusalem, in Israel. But of course, you've got people coming and going from all around the world to come and visit, come on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And so it starts to, and that's of course where the church explodes eventually, is in the diaspora, in the Roman Greek speaking world. So very quickly, we've got a community without any leadership. So they put leadership in why? Because the widows aren't being cared for. So again, remember that this is a key concept. When it talks about the widows and the poor, it's actually talking about the principles of God aren't being obeyed. And we're talking about economic principles. So it's that if the tithe isn't coming in, if the finances aren't coming into a central pool, then that money can't be distributed to the widows and the poor. So in Acts chapter 6, we see this economic principle very much being given, and we can see different discussions about offerings as well. But since we're talking specifically about tithing, I think that's definitely, and then of course we can go to Hebrews chapter 7, where it uses Melchizedek as the example. And of course, he's not only, and that's primarily being used as an example of priesthood, but again, Melchizedek is very clearly linked to the idea of tithing, which is very clear. That first principle we spoke about, the 10% giving. So he represents civil, but actually in the book of Hebrews, it's being used in an example of priesthood. So again, the representative of God being given 10%, therefore that principle of tithing through the use of Melchizedek is very strongly represented there.
Yeah.
I would almost put the question back to you. Show me where tithing has ceased in the New Testament. Because,
and the answer would be nowhere. Yeah.
And that's more the concept. I mean, because we are New Testament believers, we can discount everything that's in the Old Testament. What we see when we move from the Old Testament to the New, yes, some things stop. For example, sacrifice stops. We're not sacrificing goats and lambs anymore. We're not taking our grain and burning it on an altar anymore. It's those. So why? Because Jesus was the ultimate sacrifice once and for all. So there is no need for blood sacrifice. There is no need for washing of sin anymore. So it becomes a complicated thing when we start to include and not include. So you can have issues with slavery and other what appear to be horrendous issues, or if you look at the healthcare responsibilities, you read through the book of Leviticus, you're not going to read through the book of Leviticus and check to see if you've got a pimple and some pus, and if it's what color, and if the hair's coming through or not coming through. You're going to go and see a doctor. Okay, so there's those principles which are not, but they're the important fundamental spiritual principles, unless they are excluded or stopped, i.e. sacrifice, you have to have a very good reason. So giving is a spiritual principle. So it continues on. Now you can look at the complexity of you can then sort of say with, well, I don't know if I need to give for military support because we have a government that does that. So if you want to go by the principle of 3 tithes, which is some people do, I think there's a fair enough argument to say, well, the government looks after that and I pay my taxes, and those sort of foundational community activities are not there. But what activity has continued all the way through the New Testament is the priesthood. In the New Testament, we call apostle, pastor, teacher, evangelist. So it's clearly representative. There is no removal of the priesthood. There is just a different understanding of the priesthood as we move forward, the representatives of God.
I would also probably argue for helping the poor as well, because even though, in Western culture, the poor are often taken care of by government and certainly by charity as well. I think one of the things that's been lost in Western culture is that we often don't know anyone who's poor that's near us, who we circle with, and therefore we don't have the heart and compassion for the poor that Scripture makes so clear that we have to. So I think that I would link in the poor thing still, I think, is very important to be part of that picture as well as the priesthood.
When we start to look at the New Testament, one of the big foundations that's represented in the New Testament is synagogue. And
Mm.
synagogue had a huge variety of tasks. If you were going on pilgrimage to and from Jerusalem, it's going to take you 3 months. You would stay overnight in the synagogue every night along the way if there was one to stay in. That was part of their function. They would monitor and resolve civil disputes. They would be the place of distribution. Now, I think and I'm saying this in a negative way, but in a scaled down version of church that we have at the moment, where we turn up on Sunday and we sing some songs and we listen to the preaching and we give finances, that is a very much scaled down version, but it's not
Of
the
what
whole
these guys are
picture of
doing.
what we see in the
Yeah.
New Testament. Now, it's a growing phenomenon that we see, whereas there is a huge amount of ministries being started, like yours, like mine, and different Christian charities that are around the place that are doing that social welfare and other functions. So that is where the work of God is being done, that finance can come in and be supported. On the contrary side, if we're all tithing rather than an average of about 1% finance coming in from representative of the
terrible,
congregation,
yeah.
if we were all
yeah.
giving 10%, there would be so much money overflowing out of the local church that every local church of more than 100 people would have a local food bank, would have a local youth program, would have, dozens of different, would be supporting missionaries all around the world. We would have so many different programs that these charities that had evolved, Christian charities and post-Christian charities, they wouldn't be there because
they wouldn't
the
be
church,
needed.
because that's what the synagogue did, right? So that was what the synagogue function was. So, and that we then morph into meeting in homes. We morph into the church still meets in synagogues for almost 300 years. Even like there's an interesting site in Turkey where there's evidence of the church and Christians and Jews meeting together in a synagogue in around 110, 120 AD. So they were still even actually worshipping together for quite a long period of time afterwards. So it then eventually becomes Romanized. And one of the Romanizations is that the temple was a place where you come to give sacrifice and that's it. The Roman temple was not a place of society and community. The Roman temple, or the basilica, which is 300 to 600 AD, it becomes the place where you go and you give your sacrifice to God. The priest does his function. The priest gives his... Now, when we put that into a Jewish context, you come to the temple, you bring your sacrifice, you hand it over to the priest does that. But that is such a minute part of what the faith community was at that point in time. But we, the Romans, we Romanized the church, and that became the predominant model. And all the other things became add-ons: social welfare, charity, looking after the poor, all become add-ons. When something becomes an add-on to your community, when things get tough and when things get tight, the add-ons fall away. So we live in a very individualistic...
Yeah, no, yeah, absolutely. It just makes me think then, so you're saying the early church not only did it meet at homes, but also met in the synagogue. And does therefore that mean that they would have likely then to continue to tithe as they had been? That wouldn't have, it's unlikely that it would have ceased.
So interesting thing that we see in the New Testament, we have to understand the early church was a very slight variation on the Jewish community. So you could live your whole life in Rome. You would never, for your economic status, you may have been a slave, whatever. You might have just been a person who couldn't afford to travel. So you would never, ever come to Jerusalem to offer sacrifice. If you were lucky, you would do that once in your lifetime. So you needed to establish a community of faith. You still believed in God. You still read scripture. You still prayed. So all of those things came into place as a separate function outside of the sacrificial system. And then every year, someone from that community would be given the privilege to go to Jerusalem and offer sacrifice on behalf of the whole community. So we see that a reverse example of that. The Ethiopian eunuch is coming back with a scroll. You don't have a scroll for personal use. This is for the whole community. He's got the bucks, so he's paid for the scroll, and he's bringing it back to Ethiopia for the whole community to be able to use. I've got a scroll from Jerusalem. This is the gold standard. It doesn't get any better than that. So you've got all these things that are in place So to devolve the early church down to a few people meeting in a home, well, they met in a home. Jesus had house church every single day of the week except for the Sabbath. Joseph would come in. Peter, let's use Peter for example. How do you think Jesus knew who Peter was? Because Peter would come after fishing every day. He would come into a home situation. They would study the word of God for at least 1 or 2 hours and pray. Then they'd go home and have their evening meal. That was the standard operating procedure of a Jewish devout man. So the church takes that on. So what do we see? So we see them meeting together in houses and praying and studying the word of God. But they do that so then they go off to synagogue or they go off to the temple, depending on where they are. So then let's move forward 100 years. Temple's completely gone, no hope of it being restored. We then have a different system that starts to evolve in the Jewish community, which is a very similar system to what we see in the Christian community, that being we don't need temple anymore because Jesus is a sacrifice once and for all. The Jews are going, we don't know when we're going to have a temple again. So we need to have a system of prayer, offerings, and different elements of what the Torah says as far as obeying the laws of God are concerned. So dietary requirements and other things that we don't have. So that evolves as their place together. So it is normal practice of behavior to come together, pray, read the word of God, and discuss it, which is very different to what we do. We read, we come together and we listen to someone else tell us. We don't listen to different people give their different views, which I'm not completely opposed to anyway. That could be a very scary world, but it's called the internet. So you've got, sorry, I've diverted off and I don't know where we are anymore, but I think
we're talking about the early church here and whether it's likely that they would have tithed, given that they were in that home and in the synagogue environment, they're going between the two. And I guess I'd add to that is it likely that Jesus himself tithed? I mean, we know he was a carpenter, obviously, but then he obviously had his 3 years of ministry and traveling around. Is it likely that he would have tithed as well? Would it just been a normal part of his life? I assume so.
Yeah. So, I mean, tithing is a very clear commandment of the Old Testament, right? And if you are, the Bible tells us if you are guilty of one part of the law, you're guilty of the whole law. So, of course, we look into that then takes us into the theological concept that Jesus is like us, but without sin. And so we have to go, okay, tithing is one of the concepts. And we see that he must have tithed, because if he didn't, this would have been an issue that the Pharisees and the other rabbis and
picked up on.
the Herodians and everybody would have brought up as an accusation against him, and that would have been it. Done deal. Because it's such a foundational principle of how you live your faith is about caring for the poor and the widows, and we see that with so many practical examples of what he did for the poor, the widow, the sick, in the form of individual and corporate miracles. So we see that Jesus absolutely did that. And when I was thinking about this yesterday in preparation, my mind went to the Jesus throwing over the money changers table, right? So we can see there's a question there, something to do with finance. What's going on? It really upset Jesus. It wasn't, because what you would do, you would go and you needed a specific coin that you could give as your offering to the temple. Why? Because most coins had an image on it, therefore don't have any graven images. So they would use it for day-to-day trade, but you are not giving an image of Caesar as your offering in the temple. So you have to give a specific coin, which meant that coin was a valuable commodity. So now the issue there is not around giving to the temple. The issue there is profiting off people who are giving to God. So that's the issue. So we see people who are actually, in what it tells us in today's terminology, is probably not that horrendous, when they're probably looking at somewhere between 8 to 15%. If you've ever traveled overseas and tried to get cash anymore, it's pretty. If you get about 5 or 6% on your exchange rate, you're doing pretty good. So everybody's gouging you as you do international travel and trying to buy something with transaction fees and all that sort of thing. But so I'm going, okay, so this is the principle. Jesus doesn't come into the temple and turn away people with their lambs on the Passover to give a sacrifice. He even instructs, oh yeah, well, here's a gold coin. You can go and give my offering to the temple. This is an offering for both of us to the temple. So, which is a really, really interesting concept, because we then move into the period of time when the priesthood in Jerusalem was pretty universally seen as corrupt. So we've got a corrupt priesthood, or at least an illegitimate priesthood. We've got a priesthood that is so stinking rich, it's unbelievable. They are living and if you go to Jerusalem, there's a thing called the burnt house. You've got to check it out. You've got to see the palatial residence that the priests were living in. So they were doing pretty good. So there's no criticism of Jesus as the palatial lifestyle that the priests are living. There's no restricting or holding back any offerings or anything that are going to that, because again, you are giving to God and the priest is merely the representative. So when we look at it from several different angles, Jesus doesn't seem to reject the concept in any way, where he had so many reasons to reject it, as in natural reasons, but he had one reason not to reject it, that being the Torah, the 613 instructions, and those that revolved around financial giving, Jesus always adhered to, including giving to the temple. His family took him down to the temple and they gave offerings for him at the appropriate times in his childhood and development. So everywhere we see, there is never a rejection of financial giving to the temple, to the priesthood. We move into the New Testament, and what's Jesus called? A rabbi. And we start to see what happens in today's culture and society. There's no priests in the Jewish community anymore. Forgive me if I'm wrong for that. There might be some people who come from a priestly line and can identify that. But there's no functional priest anymore because there's nowhere to offer a sacrifice. But there's rabbis, rabbi, teacher. So this is what we see. So the rabbi, as Jesus goes out and sends them out 2 by 2, he talks about don't take any money with you. Why? Because there's an expectation that you, as the rabbi, priest, representative of God, doing the work of God, should be supported by finances according to the ministry of God. Sorry, according to the word of God.
Yeah, it makes good sense. That makes very good sense. Fantastic.
So we end up.
Yep. Go on.
So we end up with a simple foundational place that we can make a really good argument. Other people can make better arguments than me, who have thought this and studied it more intelligently than I have. But you have the military and the governance and society that was being supported in the Old Testament, and you've got the priesthood that's being supported. We do not need to support the government because we support them through taxes. And we are, as Gentile believers, that's not a requirement for us anyway, but there has never been an alleviation of the requirement to support the priesthood. What's the priesthood in the New Testament? It's a rabbi, it's a teacher, it's a priest, it's a prophet, it's a minister. It's clearly defined as someone who is doing the work of God.
And therefore we should be supporting them. Yeah.
Therefore, we should be supporting them.
Yeah.
That person.
That person. Yeah.
That person.
Okay. Well, that leads to then the question then, because a lot of people will be thinking, well, with tithing, is it always to my local church, or could it be to the broader kingdom activities? Particularly as you know, things like, say, we talked about poverty before. If you were tithing under the old system, it would have gone in and been distributed to the widows and the poor, which in today's churches, some churches are very actively engaged with the poor, but many are not. So, yeah, is it always to the local church, do you think?
Yeah. So I think, again, when we see the evolution, I'll say the 3 monotheistic faiths, an interesting quote that one of my missionary friends used to give me is that someone who was sharing the gospel with a Muslim would say, "Can I worship God on the back of a camel?" Now, the idea was that nomadic life, all you need is a prayer mat face towards Mecca, and you're worshiping God. If you're a Jewish person and you want to get married, all you need is 4 tent poles and a covering to be under while you're doing that. It's the church that morphed into this physical location as the primary identifier of church. So, and many people, whether it be home church or different types of community, haven't prioritized that for any particular reason. Also, when we look at throughout history, buildings go, wars happen, invasions happen, people come, they destroy land and different things are particularly gone. So when you can have a building, great. When that building facilitates the ministry, fantastic. When it houses lots of different activities, wonderful. But primarily, it is always the men and women of God doing the work of God that need to be supported. And therefore, that many times that means a place to come together as a community of worship. So if we look at the understanding what the Greek says about a church is always the congregation. It's not the building.
Not the building, yeah.
So,
and I think that's probably been lost in our culture, because every Sunday we say, what are you doing? You're going to church, as opposed to going to be with fellow believers, so to speak.
And I am completely ingrained into that myself. So I go, I understand it.
Yeah.
And that's, I go to church. Where do I go to church? In the cinemas. Oh, that's a bit strange. No, but that's where we go to church. Now, what do? We want to be out of the cinemas. So we've actually now bought a building, where I go, where my church is. So now we're going through all the regs with council and all that sort of stuff. I think we're into about year 3 after buying the building that we'll, trying to get everything sorted and ready. So, but yeah, it's about that aspect. So when we look at it as a New Testament perspective, we look at all the different aspects of what we should be doing. Now, we can't do them all. I can't visit a prison. I can't do everything. I can't feed the poor. I can't look after the widows. I can't do all that as a self. Whereas as a congregation, we can do that. As the church, broad-based, you go out and you say you help people with, financial issues that they're having, or making pastors and churches a little bit more financial savvy about the decisions that they're making. I'm out training pastors in different parts of the world who can't get to training any other way. So, there's very specific things that are being done that God's called people to individually and corporately do as a group. That activity is the church. So I would suggest that activity as the church, that's appropriate for a tithe. And if you're not comfortable with that, fine. Let's make it an offering.
Yeah.
It's not about doing less. It's about doing more and trusting.
I was going to say, my perspective, I guess, perception of Jesus's teaching is he always raises the bar. You never see him lower it, whether he's talking about marriage and divorce. Pick your topic. Jesus raises it, doesn't lower it. And you would think that under the amazing grace that he's given us, that would call for a higher standard, not a lower one.
Absolutely. And you look at that, and it's so much more to do with the heart. This might, I won't divert into that. But you see that what Jesus is talking about is going, you can go, here's the principle, right? Here's the letter, let's call it the letter of the law. Here's the letter of the law, what you must do. And then what Jesus adds on top of that over and again, here's the heart and the spirit behind it. This is the why, this is the love, this is the compassion of God behind that activity. Yes, you can have the spirit of the law the letter of the law, which brings death, which means that if you can obey everything that God tells you to do, but if you don't have love, mercy, and compassion, it's clean symbol, it's hollow. It doesn't resound, because you're only picking up on one aspect of what God wants you to do. So why does God want us to support things financially? Because he wants to make sure you're supporting his representative on earth, the priest. And he wants to make sure that you're looking after people who are made in his image, which, racism astounds me with believers, because they are made in the image of God. That person's made in the image of God. That widow's made in the image of God. That poor person's made in the image of God. That stranger or Gentile's made in the image of God. So you've got that that heart aspect that comes out through this so often that we can, that I think that Jesus definitely is leading us to. So Jesus is saying tithing 101. It's a given. You tie your shoelaces up in the morning. You know, if you can, you know, now let's talk about what goes on top of that.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the heart. Let's talk about the spirit. Let's talk about let's talk about who's my neighbor, because that's a huge thing, because that question is a financial question. Who's my neighbor? What does he do? The guy gives out money. It's a financial question, because if I can say you're not my neighbor, I have no financial responsibility for you. Nothing, you know, absolutely minor. You might be required to give a coin if you have a coin on you, which is why Peter says, silver and gold have I none. He doesn't say I don't have a coin. He says silver and gold, because you're part of my community. I am obligated to give you silver and gold. If you are not part of my community, i.e. a Gentile, this guy's not a Gentile because he's in the temple, I'd be required to give you a coin, i.e. the copper coin that the widow's mite gave. So it's always around that, well, I can't give you money, but what I can give you the love of God. I can give you healing. I can give you some practical sort of support. So it's not just, for some people, it's very easy to give money, and what they need to work on is the heart attitude. For some people who've got great hearts and maybe are financially challenged, so they've got to work on the financial side of things. So, you know, it's a lovely tension that we find all the way through the Bible. It's not just one or the other. It's the two things pulling together. And I guarantee everybody listening to this would be on one side of the camp or the other. I find it really easy to love, care, give time, give compassion, sit and listen to someone. I find it really easy to give money, but just don't ask me to do anything. Don't ask me. I'll give you double the tithe if I don't have to have a conversation or listen to someone and pray for them. You know, so we're all differently molded, and the Bible is constantly pulling us in either direction to actually keep us in balance, to make us more Christ-like.
Fantastic. Well, just jumping back for a minute, because you know, we did the old and we've talked about the new, but I wanted to touch on Malachi. This is you know, a passage I've heard quite a bit. Obviously, it's often associated with prosperity preachers as well, but it's probably important to understand the context, because it's often taught that if you don't tithe, then you are robbing God. And I think there's a risk here in the way that that's expressed, and potentially to manipulate people. But then also equally, there's the idea that if you do tithe, then you'll be blessed because of it. So how do we, I guess, address these issues in their correct context? What do you think God, I guess, is really trying to tell us? How do you sort of interpret it?
Yeah, so you look at the overall context of the book of Malachi, you've got another corrupt priesthood. Very, very common when you actually go through the Old Testament. You know,
human beings are terrible things, aren't we?
I know. And it's sort of, it removes the basic fundamental excuse. I don't want to give to you because you're a rotten person. I don't want to give to you because you're not preaching good enough. I don't want to give to you because you're not supporting the poor. You're doing something wrong, right? So, so Malachi just removes that. Says there's actually no excuse, because your tithe is to God, not to the priest. Now the priest lives off the tithe, and
is accountable ultimately too.
He's accountable, and the priest and it's again, using that as a generic word, it talks about the teacher has greater responsibility, the bishop has greater responsibility, the apostle has greater responsibility, the prophet has huge responsibility for what comes out of their mouth. So there's a higher level of responsibility on all of those who are called to serve God as to what they're doing. But their responsibility is God, not the congregation or a believer saying, oh, I don't think you've met that responsibility, therefore I'm not going to tithe, I'm not going to support, I'm going to withdraw my support. And I've seen that done to remove a pastor where the big money givers in the church stop supporting him financially until the pastor offered his resignation, until they got somebody in, and then suddenly the offering skyrocketed again. And this was apparently, you know, honoring and great blessing of God. No, it was people manipulating the situation with their personal finances.
100%.
So,
wow.
So I think that to me is a really blunt, simple message in there, which we don't like.
Yeah.
That being, if you're tithing, you are, let's put it this way. So the way I understand my relationship with God is that I live under the blessing of God. Okay. Genesis chapter 1. Be blessed, be fruitful, and multiply. So the first thing that God did with humanity is he blessed them. So we're blessed. Sin enters in. And so now we've got the blessing and the curse, which is sort of the context of this passage here. So we can have this mindset that the blessing of God is this little dot of life that we live on. And if we dare do something wrong, we move out of that blessing and then suddenly we're under the curse and everything goes wrong. Whereas I prefer to see it as living under the blessing is this huge space that God has created us for, because he's created us to live under the blessing, be blessed. He doesn't want to remove the blessing, but then sin enters in. Okay, so this falls into the category of sin, which that's okay. Everything falls into the category of sin, but we think sin is murder and pedophilia and all the most horrendous things that you can imagine is sin. And my little problems over here aren't really sin. It's just, I've got some character issues that I'm working on, which is true, but it's all sin. And unfortunately, there is no grading of sin. So, but we live under the blessing of God. Old Testament talks about a covering. The New Testament talks about us being washed in the blood of Jesus. And guess what? It's not that easy to wash off the blood of Jesus. And the blood of Jesus, we remain that blessing. And then when we make deliberate, willful choices to move out, we move ourselves out of the blessing. But we ask for forgiveness, we return ourselves back to the place of blessing. So the question is not, we're living, the reality is the earth is, as Malachi says, is suffering under the curse. We as believers live in a world that's suffering under the weight of sin. So we walk in the blessing of God to the best of our ability, but we can't be perfect. So if we can't be perfect, we can't just fall out of the blessing every single time we cross the road and do something. Yeah. I mean, otherwise we'd be in and out, in and out, in and out, in and out. We live under the blessing. And even with ourselves, as we grow in God, we can't handle all the things that we're doing wrong at one time or sinful at one time. And that's part of the progressive work of Christ, that we are progressively being shifted and changed. If otherwise, there'd be stuff going on in our whole life and we'd never be under the blessing because we're constantly struggling with sin. So my view is that we're under the blessing, but hang on, let me tell you about this thing that could be a problem in your life. If you don't tithe, it's a problem. And that problem's called sin. And it's a very blunt description that you can't use a crappy priesthood as an excuse to sin before God, in the same way that you can't use having a crappy husband or wife as an excuse to beat the living daylights out of them. And in the same way that you can't, because a politician is a horrible person, go out and murder them. You can't use that as an excuse.
Justify. Yeah.
You can't justify or use that as an excuse. So when God brings you to the point where you have a revelation about these things, then you become aware and responsible for how you respond to that. But you need to become aware and responsible, understanding what God's trying to do in blessing you and caring for you in that. So that's Brendan's principled approach, as in not on principled person, but different principles to live by, rather than quoting a scripture at someone. What are the principles I try and live by?
Just to put two scenarios to you, and these are probably one would be more common than the other, and one's probably a bit more peripheral. But if we think about our local churches, and let's imagine I'm a very wealthy Christian, maybe I earn a huge amount of money every year, a couple of $1 million a year. Should I be tithing to my local church, particularly given that I would make up potentially, if it's a small church, a very huge portion of its budget? And the second one is at the other end, and that's really, as I say, possibly more common these days. If I'm a poor Christian, and maybe a common one, particularly in Western culture these days, is single parenthood. I'm a single mum. I've got 2 or 3 kids, really struggling to get by. I'm on Centrelink or Social Security. Should I be tithing? They're two they're not that uncommon, particularly the second one. How do we address some of those, I guess, nuances, if you like?
Yeah, look, let's go with the wealthy. I would go back to the original principle of giving to the church. Okay, being the understanding of that the church is not just the local congregation and the people meeting in that building, that as your local congregation should be your primary place of support. But if you're blessed to have enough economic means, then I would suggest that you certainly continue to give. You certainly tithe to different Christian or give to different Christian ministries. The challenge on that side of things that I would put out to people who live in that space is this is not for you to control the finance. You could control the finance by being 50% of the giving in a local church. You can also control the finance by setting up your own economic situation where people have to do what you require in order for you to give them the money. I mean, so it's the principle of you lay your offering at the apostles' feet. And what does that mean? Your obligation is to come and to give, and then release from what that money is used for. So you need to be able to do that. Now then there's governance and there's foundation and there's charities and there's different board and governance roles which people have to be responsible for, which is great. And I'm not saying that. But a basic foundational principle is that you should not seek to control those who are doing the work of God with your giving. That's the number one principle. How you give and how you set it up is entirely up to them. And it's a hard issue, right? I don't know if you're attempting to control. It's a hard issue. So that would be around those who have excess funds to make sure that you're not looking for privilege, position, control.
Sadly, I have seen that, in some of our consulting to churches, you hear these stories. I always say to pastors, you got to toughen up on this one. If people come saying, hey, I want the plaque on the wall because I've, given X, Y, Z, or I want to have a say over church policy before we do anything, the pastor's just got to say no.
Yeah,
it's tough because there's a lot of pressure there, particularly balancing budgets and paying wages and all these sort of things. So it's not an easy job being a pastor when it comes to the financial aspects.
It's a very, very real reality from both sides. There's we're human beings, and if you I don't want to use the word fortunate, but if you've got significant wealth that you've earned, there's probably been some business nous and some other things behind that you've been able to accumulate that wealth, or if it's inherited, keep that wealth, whatever it might be. So there's some smarts around your wealth being able to keep it and distribute. And you probably look at a pastor and go, they don't have the business nous and the financial smarts, but you can't impose yourself on that situation.
Well, they're also
giving to God.
Yeah, 100%. But you're also right, though, because of the nous, they're often used to sending money. I'll start this product. I'll do this. I'll do that. And so they're thinking, I can come into the church. I'll give this money. But hey, the pastor's got to go and do X with it. Yeah. And so that's a different. I guess that's a difficult spiritual issue that they have to work through in their own life, because ultimately, they've got to be good stewards of the funds that God's given them. But as you say, they've got to release it into the apostles' care.
Yeah, and let me tell you that the church and ministry is the worst financial business investment that you can ever make. So, what do I mean by that? That if we try and use a financial principle of running a crusade, running an event, running a program, like let's just say, typical a lot of churches do. I'm running a food outreach program. I'm running a program to the homeless. Okay, so we have spent X amount of staff time, finances. The businessman goes, what's our return? How many souls? What's our return on investment? Whereas, the Bible talks about sowing and, and watering and planting and reaping. And, the spiritual principle is you can do all the damn hard work that you want, and somebody else is going to get the reward, i.e. if the only reward is that person making a decision for Jesus. Yeah. So that's what I mean. It's just, you have to be smart. You just can't throw money.
Well, it's an interesting one, because I think you described me there. Just in a nutshell, exactly how I think. I always go, what's this event going to achieve? How many souls are we going to get? That's how I literally do think. But I think I think you're right, and there's a danger in thinking just like that, because there's a sowing and a watering, etc. But the flip side of that is there's got to be an accountability for what we actually do, and that we do ultimately look at the way we do things and ask, is this really what God's wanting us to do? Because if God's wanting us to do it, then the watering or whatever it may be is what we've got to be doing. So yeah, it's a tough one with our human human nature.
And my basic principle is investing into something. So, you know, I'll invest into staff, I'll invest into capacity. That's my basic philosophy in my personal finances, my personal life and church life and ministry life. I invest to high capacities and people and systems and stuff like that that'll set up the environment for God to move. We can't make God move, but at the same time, I'm not going to be passive and just throw money around and go, oh, this person needs a job, and you know, Auntie Joe needs to pay their electricity bill, and all this sort of stuff that just throws money around without thinking, well, how's that going to, you know, eventually work itself out. So
we've got to. I always just say to people, you've got to come back to the starting point, which is actually God's money, and therefore that's something to be taken seriously. You know, we take it seriously how we handle God's money, and therefore that should shape how we think, and the dedication to praying through it and trying to honor God with it and glorify God with it. So
and you know, and going back to Malachi and also going to the New Testament times, a corrupt priesthood or an incompetent pastor is actually not an excuse not to give to God. You might change church, you might give your money somewhere else, but it's not an excuse to stop giving. Particularly if you're a high net worth individual, or if it's a large amount of money for you as an individual, right? That can be any amount of money. It can be a very significant gift for an individual of $1,000, might be a huge gift, right? And if you walk away feeling disappointed and discouraged because what was said or hoped to happen didn't happen, or worse still, you know, somebody went out and bought themselves a yacht and had a holiday and stole the money from the church and, you know, did horrible things with the money that was intended for God. That's their responsibility before God. But we're humans and we look at it and it can eat away at us. I acknowledge that. But lift yourself above that. I'm giving to God. Keep giving to God. Find a way to do it. Find a way to overcome. So the poor, it's interesting. I don't know when we would start and stop that description. I know the description you're giving is of the single parent.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking probably more Western culture, because obviously you could argue in third world they may.
Yeah, I was thinking Western culture, but going the other way. You know, I'm poor because I send my 2 kids off to private schools and need to have my 3 overseas holidays every year. So I'm struggling because I can only afford a $50 bottle of wine this weekend. So, and the reason why I'm saying that is because poverty is a mentality. Interestingly, in what I've done, I'm having to really think through the way I use the word poverty, because when I go to Africa and these people are living on a fraction of what we would get as social security benefits here, they are offended if I call them poor. And I was berated by one on a couple of about 2 years ago about how dare you call us poor. And I went, and that's because they'd read the website, not because I'd called them poor. So I mean, it's a mindset. So, but let's go to what we would agree would be people who are struggling in our society, people who are living on some form of benefit. And you know, with the way electricity and gas prices are going at the moment, that's a real issue and a real struggle.
It's cost of living is a massive problem.
Huge. Housing is a huge issue. Food is exploding at the moment. So all those things are real, genuine sort of things. So for me, and again, I know it's easy to go to this biblical story of the widow giving the 2 mites. Now, the background, the historical and theological background of that is she only had to give one coin. So there was an exemption for her to give one coin because she was in a desperate economic situation. She gives 2 coins. So she gives her full obligation to God. And my reading between the lines, she says, if I give this money to God and this is my last meal and I walk out of this place and die, I put God first place in my life. And that's the number one priority for me. The interesting thing is, apart from the story being remembered, we don't know anything else about her, which I love. There's no, oh, she went out and suddenly a rich man came up to her and gave her an ingot of gold, or anything like that to sort of give some sort of idea of financial compensation for giving to God. So giving to God, as with the rich person, the poorer person, it's about relationship with God. Where do I put my trust? So until you can put your trust in God, until you can read those scriptures about giving and have them deeply ingrained within your being that this is what I need to do, you can start to tithe, you can start to give, and most people will only do it for a very short period of time, i.e. one pay packet, one benefit check, because it's not a spin the wheel of a lottery and you're going to get a payout. It doesn't work like that. It's about putting your trust in God. Right. I've had this conversation with many people over the journey, and people have come to me and from outside of the church and said, we need help. And I've said to them, okay, happy to do that, but can you give something to God? I can't afford to give something to God. And I went through this. I said to the guy, exact tithing conversation. He said he was a believer. And I said, so how much do you earn? What's your benefit check? Oh, okay, so if you tithe, this is how much it would be. And he said, oh, I can't afford that. And I then went, well, what about this amount? What about this amount? And I got down to 20 cents when 20 cents was 20 cents. And he said, no, I can't afford to give that. And I said, well, the issue that you have is that you don't trust God. It's not about how much. Because if you can't even give 20%, which back in that day, I can't even think what 20 cents would have bought even back then.
Yeah,
but
not much.
It's no.
Candy.
And I sort of went, okay, this is this is a mindset that we're dealing with. And I want to think of another word, but I can't at the moment. It's a poverty mindset. And that's why I was talking about the person who sends their kids to a private school and has the overseas holiday. They can have that exact same
mindset, 100%.
That same poverty mindset. So it revolves around, do I trust God? And my personal story, and I think the scriptural teaching is that the blessing of God comes in many, many different ways. So when we give, sometimes that will be financial blessing, and I can tell you story after story about that. But more often than not, let's say 90% of the time, it's other blessings. It's blessings in relationship. It's blessings in healing. It's blessing in restoration of a relationship, a door opening, something moving forward. So I would just, if I can plant a final seed before we go, is that if you're giving to God, do not look for just a financial return. Look for a blessing return to come back into your world, and it needs to become a consistent lifestyle, that it's part of who you are. And once you break the back of it, try and stay the road, because there will be financial challenges. You're the financial advisor. Everybody has regular cycles of financial challenges. So, and once you push through some of those, you'll do really well. Now, to be fair, this is not an issue for me. Sorry, it is an issue, but it's not one of the issues that I greatly struggle with. I've got plenty of other issues that I greatly struggle with. Giving is not one of them. It's a gift, if I can call it that. It's an area that I've been able to move into, and God has given me huge immediate returns in a few key moments. One, I was at a conference very young. I was maybe 19, 18, something like that. Gone to a conference in Sydney. I had my bus fare back. I had my accommodation. I felt, they were asking for an offering. I just felt to go and give everything. Now I'm on the other side of town in Sydney. I've got to be there for another couple of days. I have no credit card, no debit card. I have cash. That's all we had.
Yeah.
And I go up and I give, and then it's sort of like, it didn't even worry me as to what I was going to eat, how I was going to get home on the bus or public transport. It hadn't dawned on me. As I walk back, someone comes up to me and says, as I'm literally walking back from the offering, someone comes out of their chair and says, "Oh, God's told me to give this to you, $20.
Wow.
And so I mean, that's great. I can now get back to my accommodation. I can eat tonight and tomorrow. It hadn't even dawned on me because it was such a compulsion that God said to give that amount. And I could tell you half a dozen stories like
I've got plenty of those stories I've heard people over the years share. Yeah. It's great.
And those moments, particularly when, and like everybody, we had significantly, seriously challenging times financially in COVID, and still continue on to a degree where I'm trying to work through some of those issues now. And for years, we've just been praying and believing for God for a breakthrough. And it's still yet to happen. So, but do we stop our giving? No, we just keep on giving.
Being faithful. Faithful is critical.
Being faithful and going, God. And part of what we're seeing in this is we believe it is an attack of the enemy, because if we get this sorted, it will set us up financially to continue on in the ministry for the next 10, 20 years. But there's got to be that breakthrough point, which we believe and understand is coming, but people are trying to stop it from happening. So, so it doesn't stop. That's what I'm saying. It doesn't stop from the moment when you first do it. It's got to become a lifestyle, and then it gets ingrained in, I need to pray, I need to believe, I need to seek God. And there's got to be those areas in your life, whether it be healing, whether it be finances, whether it be people in your life who've gone away from God, people in your life who you want to come to God. It's those things that draw you to God, to pray, to seek, to come close to him. For some people, it's finances. For other people, it's other things. But for everybody, it'll be some part of your life at some point. Absolutely. Understand that is to draw you to God, not to push you away.
100%. It's a heart issue at the end of the day, and God wants your heart, and he's gonna help bring you closer.
Exactly right. Don't feel condemned if you're not there yet, but really honestly seek God and try and I
often encourage, particularly with the second example, the one that's struggling, I often encourage incremental giving. You start at 1%, you keep working your way up. So I always say to people, you always give something, no matter how small. You always give something, and you work your way out from there. So as you say, it's not a legalistic thing or anything like that. It's more just the principle that we sow and that we keep sowing, and we just do, as our situations change and improve, we sow more.
So here's a little thought and idea. I was reading about the idea. I can't remember if I read it in the Bible or a Jewish person told me about, you need to have, if someone asks you for something, you should have something in your pocket to give. It was probably when I was in Jerusalem. It was sort of like an extra step that you would go. And I came back from studying in Jerusalem. I said to my wife, I said, we just let's just determine to be a little bit more generous, just a little bit. Be ready to give. And so we decided as a practical thing, this is probably 20 years ago, that we would always pay for coffee if we went out for coffee with someone. Now,
I'll hold you to that. Next time I see you.
I'm the missionary now, so I expect to be well supported. But no, and so for me, it wasn't a problem in church community. There was a concept of giving, and I said, but my wife, when she was in a secular employment, it really threw people. No, I'll get it. You got it last time. No, I'll get it. People did not want that sense of indebtedness through a simple thing of buying a coffee. So that actually started an interest. So what I'm telling you with that is that if you're comfortable with the concept of tithing, just find a little way to maybe stretch yourself. It doesn't have to be a large amount. If you're comfortable with tithing, it's interesting. Are you comfortable with doing something small? Are you comfortable with giving half an hour of your time? Are you comfortable with paying for someone's coffee without expecting reciprocal for it to come back. It's not, I'm not talking about going, we're all going to shout each other a beer at the pub mentality. It's find something where you can be a little bit generous and not have to post it on social media, by the way.
Yes, accept your reward in private. Your reward will be in heaven.
Yes,
rather than
a whole
the glorification from man.
There's a whole thing going on at the moment with the pay it forward stuff, which was a great concept. But now there's a whole thing where people are building social media platforms around, or I'm going to buy this person a coffee, I'm going to pay for their groceries, and then I'm going to film their response. And I'm a wonderful person, by the way, I'm making money out of my social media marketing as a result of that. So anyway, just do what's right in your heart, and
seek God.
Understand that you're going to have struggles from time to time, and that's a good thing. That's a normal thing. That's the way it's meant to be.
And that's the way trust gets built.
Yep. And each one of us are going to be gifted to be stronger in certain areas and not so strong in other areas. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, look, Brennan, it's been absolutely fantastic. I feel personally I've learned a lot from listening to you speak. It's been brilliant. And I think just a lot of really just useful nuggets and wisdom that people can apply, and to really, wrestle with it. I think it's listening to you talk, you mentioned seeking God. I think people need to wrestle with this topic and do it with the view that God will show them. And so thank you very much for your time today. It's been brilliant having you.
No worries. It's always fun chatting with you, Alex. And all the best to everyone.
Fantastic.
Hey there, just a quick intermission during this episode. Just want to say, hey, please subscribe to this channel. We're trying to reach as many people across the globe with the biblical financial wisdom. There's so much the Bible has to offer. So you help us by subscribing to this channel, and we can help reach as many people with biblical wisdom. So thanks for watching. God bless.